Judge has ordered a response from the White House to the lawsuit brought by CNN. A hearing now scheduled for 3:30 tomorrow, all prompted by this memorable moment.
That's
I
enough.
was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President.
That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned
indictments-
about anything with
that you
the
may have
Russian
indictments coming
investigation
down?
because it's a hoax.
Are you-
That's enough. Put down the mic.
So CNN claims that the White House is violating Acosta's First and Fifth Amendments by revoking his press pass, but the White House calls it grandstanding. Acosta has a long history of contentious interactions with President Trump, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders, and also our next guest, former Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Remember this?
Jim, I find it interesting that you somehow believe that
Of course they're going to be looking at these various things.
Okay, I get it. Somehow you seem to believe that you have all of this information. You've been read in on all of these things. No, that's not totally
because
false.
they can't afford it with
Hold
these
on.
tax credits you're providing.
No,
there's an argument to the other
No, there's
side.
not. Hold on. Hold on. Let me explain the answer to you, Jim. Calm down.
Sean Spicer joins me now on both of these breaking stories tonight. Sean, good to see you. Good evening. Welcome to the story. You remember those moments well. I guess this lawsuit will determine, or should determine, where the line is, right? What is a fair question? What is reasonable behavior, I guess, and what constitutes reason for the White House to kick somebody out or take away their pass?
Well, look, I think we need to keep focused on what you just mentioned. It's the latter, not the former. It's Mr. Acosta's behavior that is the problem. Now, look, if you ask me, I wish that we could come to a middle ground here, which is give Mr. Acosta back his pass. CNN isn't being denied their constitutional right. They've got 5 or 6 other reporters that have hard passes. So it's not a question of CNN being able to report it, and it's not a right to be able to go into the White House. It's a privilege. That being said, I think that it would behoove us all to take the temperature down a moment, say to the White House, okay, look, we're going to give Mr. Acosta his pass back, but come to an agreement with all the reporters that credentialed and say that we will agree to these minimum standards of decorum and professionalism, things that have usually gone unsaid but kept up over the years. And it wasn't until the Trump administration where you saw a lot of these people who wanted to not necessarily report, but to make themselves star. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't the nature of the question. Mr. Acosta wasn't even asking a question. He was challenging him on the premise of his use of words and his definition of them, and saying, I disagree with you.
So other folks who look at this situation, I was watching one of them talking about it just yesterday, basically said, well, no, his question, he was challenging the president on the definition of this caravan and whether or not they constituted an invasion. And their argument was that that was a legitimate question. If it was phrased rudely or it was handled rudely or inappropriately, that is one issue that needs to obviously be dealt with. But their contention was that the question itself was appropriate. Do you disagree?
No, not at all. Any member of the media should be able to ask any member of the government anything that they want. But I don't think that's what's at issue here, and I don't think the president made that an issue. It was his behavior. He asked and answered that question twice. He then asked a series of additional questions. Frankly, it was rude to the other reporters in the room who all deserve to have a question asked themselves. So this isn't about the nature of the question, and I think that that's where the lines are getting blurred. This was about Mr. Acosta's behavior and lack of respect for the office of the president. The president made it clear that Mr. Acosta's question was asked and answered twice. He went on to ask a series of additional questions. It was rude and unbecoming to his other fellow journalists more than anything else. So that raises an
interesting point, because the White House Correspondents Association is standing by Jim Acosta in this situation.
Of course they are.
You raise an interesting point, because that's also their responsibility to some extent to say, is it unfair to the other reporters in the room? Is it sucking up all of the oxygen in the room and making it all about him when there are lots of valid, important questions that need to be answered in the room? And I wonder, how much potentially they get pushback on that.
Well, I've actually spoken to several reporters, both who cover the White House, some who are much closer or served on the White House Communications Association, or Correspondents Association, rather, and those that are just covering it. And I don't think they speak for anyone by any means. There's clearly a group of journalists that are disgusted and find Mr. Acosta's behavior out of line. But what happens is, and I wrote about this in my book, that there's a bunch of groupthink and fear of going against the groupthink that they all face in there. And so right now they all feel feel compelled to come out and say it. But privately, they'll tell you that they find his behavior unacceptable and doesn't bode well for their industry.
All right. So moving on to the issue of Mrs. Trump, the First Lady, and her office releasing this, sort of really kind of unprecedented statement today, saying that with regard to the exit of Mira Ricardel, who was a deputy for the National Security Advisor John Bolton, her office said it is the position of the office of the First Lady that she no longer deserves the honor of serving in this White House, referring to Ms. Ricardel. Is that unusual?
Yeah, very much so. And look, I think one thing that you've seen from the First Lady is she chooses her causes, her statements very deliberately. When she speaks, it's for a reason. And I think that she gives, obviously, as she mentioned in that interview with David Muir that you played, she gives constant advice to her husband. She is an unbelievable political strategist. And for her to come out publicly and say this is really says something about the relationship that this particular staffer clearly has with the East Wing. And I would think that this wasn't the first rodeo or encounter that they had. You've got to have really worn out your welcome for the First Lady to publicly
the suggestion is that there was, some disagreement on the Africa trip, so that makes that soundbite that we just played from ABC particularly pertinent. But also that this woman may have been leaking stories about her. This is the second person who's an aide to John Bolton to exit the White House, and apparently the Defense Secretary Mattis was also had some issues with some of these individuals. So does that signal to you that Mattis's position is strengthened or that Bolton's is weakened? I mean, what can we take away from this?
Here's my takeaway. Don't underestimate the First Lady ever. When she speaks, take it seriously. She's got unbelievable political instincts. Her husband takes her counsel very seriously. She is very savvy when it comes to the media and the political strategy of her husband. So I would never in my life cross her. And the idea that it came to a public statement tells you that this particular person clearly didn't get the hint.
Very, very interesting. Okay, Sean, thank you so much. Good to see you tonight.